As Matt mentioned, we are between series tonight. We just wrapped up a series all about TNL, what is unique, what we about this place, what we believe. And then next week, we're going to delve into a series on the book of James, which should be a great time. But I wasn't really sure what to talk about tonight. And when that happens, I like to look back on previous talks that I've done and liked, which is a Venn diagram that is not as big as you might think. But I came across one that seems to always be appropriate whenever it has come up. I think the last time I gave something around this talk was about 4 years ago. But it's a talk all about power. Power, particularly its use and abuse, is an ongoing topic in our culture. It seems like it has been for the past long while. Postmodernism, structuralism, post-structuralism, critical theory in all its forms are all schools of thought that are, whether you realize it or not, the underpinnings of much of the current discourse today. Certainly much of the social justice discourse. It's the underpinnings of the arguments going on around Gaza and Israel, at least on American soil. And it's all chiefly concerned with power. Who has power, who doesn't? How is power gained and maintained? What would a world with greater equalization of power distribution look like? What are just and forms and uses of power? Is power inherently evil? These are all kind of questions that have been stirring around for several years. Power is an interesting thing to talk about. I think we're not always aware when we have it, and we can be painfully aware when we don't. All of us experience power over others and under others in various situations in our lives. None of us that I know of are in high offices in the government. We all know what it's like to be a citizen of under a government. We have boss-employee relationships or teacher-student relationships. We have parent-child relationships. I was just mentioning to Jay, 2 kids under 5. Yeah, under 5, almost 6. And they're doing this cool thing where both of them at the same time right now are rebelling. Like for a long time, it was like one would do it and then the other would do it. And it was fine. We could navigate that. But now they're like teaming up on us. And it's like, it's not just a coincidence. They're like conscious of it. They're like high-fiving each other when they make us angry. And they figured out like, they laugh. When one of them gets us angry, the other one laughs, which is just an interesting thing to navigate. And sometimes, I guess what I'm trying to say is it feels not so much like a parent-child power dynamic, but a child-parent power dynamic, which is a good time. How are we to respond to power, both our power and others' power? Tonight, we're going to be jumping into the middle of the story of a guy named Joseph in Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. A story that, at its worst, has been used to kind of universally teach that men and women can't trust each other. It's been used at times to promote the stereotypical idea of a man of integrity versus the lustful, conniving woman. It is a story that is certainly about integrity in the face of temptation. But primarily for our purposes tonight, it is a story about how the posture of our hearts determines how we use our power. And that's really what I want you to walk away with tonight. The posture of our hearts determines how we use our power. That probably sounds really obvious, but before we can talk about how we use our power, we have to talk about the underlying motivations of our hearts. So with that being said, I'm going to read you our text for tonight. It is a large portion, or maybe the entirety, of Genesis 39. And since it's kind of a lot to look at, I'm not going to put it up on the screen other than showing the citation. So feel free to close your eyes and listen. Just kind of do whatever is best for you on a Tuesday night after a long day, to be able to just listen to this story. It goes like this. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused, saying, "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even just be with her. One day, when he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story: "That Hebrew slave that you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Now, if you spent any time in church, certainly if you grew up in church, you've probably heard this story at least once, if not way too many times. But just so we're on the same page, a little background into this person of Joseph. He is the youngest child of a family of 12. Well, at least 12 brothers. I have 3 brothers. I can't imagine multiplying that by 4. And that's a lot of brothers. Anyway, he was also not just the youngest of 12, but the favorite. And like every good youngest son, he really lived that up and spurred on his brother's jealousy. His father famously loved him so much that he made him a coat of many colors, which musicals have been written about. You can look that up on your own time. We're not going to talk about that any further because I'm not going to sing. But Joseph gets a real big head, basically. Eventually, his brothers get so tired of his arrogance and their father loving him more than them that they plot to kill him. And then they decide at the last minute to sell him to slave traders instead, and then they come up with a scheme to tell their father that he was killed by a wild animal. That's kind of the first chapter of Joseph's life. He goes from being this adored favorite youngest son to being sold into slavery by his brothers. Super fun stuff. He's bought by a guy named Potiphar, which is where our story picked up, and he works really hard and does a really good job for this person. He becomes the head of Potiphar's house, but he's still a slave. He's still a foreigner. All his power is inherited power, power given to him by his master. How he uses this power, which we'll come back to, is very different from Potiphar's wife. Now, Potiphar's wife, you may be thinking, she's a woman in an ancient culture. She has no power. She's essentially property, just like Joseph, right? That's what I thought too when I first began researching this, especially since, unlike the men in this story, she isn't given a name. She's just Potiphar's wife. But it turns out that's totally wrong for a few reasons. First, in ancient Egypt culture, knowing someone's name meant that you had power over them. Using someone's name, their real name that was given at birth, was an act of asserting power over them. So much so that very few people ever knew a pharaoh's real name. They always chose fake names to use publicly so that the real names weren't used because, again, they believed that speaking someone else's name gave you power over them. So the fact that Joseph and Potiphar are both named, but Potiphar's wife isn't, could actually be a sign of respect or honor or deference to her. This idea, I think, is enhanced when you consider that women are named all over the place in the Old Testament, even in other stories in the same book of Genesis. Though women weren't equal with men in Hebrew culture, they were still named in their stories. So not naming Potiphar's wife may not necessarily be a knock on her. It could be a sign of respect. Secondly, this blew my mind. Ancient Egypt was incredibly progressive when it came to gender equality, which is like fascinating to me. I came across this historian named James C. Thompson, who wears a bow tie, which you just know that that dude is a legit historian if he wears a bow tie. He wrote this: while women could become pharaoh only in very special circumstances, they were otherwise regarded as totally equal to men as far as the law was concerned. They could own property, they could borrow money, they could sign contracts, they could initiate divorce, they could appear in court as a witness. Of course, they were also equally subject to whatever responsibilities normally accompanied those rights. So, unlike Joseph, Potiphar's wife has tons of inherent power that derives from who she is. She's native, she's a citizen, she's rich, and she uses this power to try to get what she wants. Now, I think it's far too simplistic to think of this story as primarily one about sexual desire. That is certainly a part of what's going on here, but I think we unlock much more of what's going on in this story when we try to see things from Potiphar's wife's perspective in the context of her day. There are two key details that make this whole scene come to life a bit more. First, there's a very subtle detail that we were told. It was in verse 6, which I'll read for you. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. This is important because, again, according to Thompson, the historian with the bow tie, unlike many ancient cultures where marriage was primarily done for out of duty or for political reasons, ancient Egyptian men and women valued and enjoyed each other's company. And love and emotional support were considered to be important parts of marriage. It wasn't just a political transaction. It was more similar to how our culture is today. Potiphar's main concern when he's home isn't his wife. It isn't his family. It's what he's going to eat. It's not a stretch to surmise that he isn't very attentive or concerned about his wife. And this idea is heightened by another bit of information that we get from verse 8, when Joseph says to Potiphar's wife, "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am." That's interesting in a culture where men and women are relatively equal. Again, according to Thompson, this is a kind of big quote that I'm about to read you. "There is little doubt that in Egypt, as in the rest of the ancient world, the man was expected to be the head of the family. But popular wisdom of the day urged husbands to avoid interfering in household matters and trust their wives to do the job properly. There was certainly enough work for everyone. There were no TV dinners, and food had to be prepared from scratch. In fact, if you wanted a loaf of bread, you would even have to grind the grain yourself. You might buy sandals, but other articles of clothing were made in the home. Those who could afford it, like in our story, had servants and slaves to do the actual work, but the mistress of the house would still be expected to supervise and to see that everything was done properly." So what's wrong with our story then? Joseph has taken the place in the house that is the normal or rightful place of Potiphar's wife. So not only does Potiphar not really pay attention to his wife, it seems, he doesn't trust her. And in fact, he trusts her so little that he appoints a foreign slave to her position instead of her. This would have been a deeply insulting gesture that communicates that she's insignificant and incompetent, and it heaps a ton of shame on her. I think one of those things would be enough for someone to crack. Being constantly ignored and thereby being told that you're insignificant, or having your purpose and sense of identity taken away and given to someone else, communicating that you're not competent, you're not good enough. Either one of those, I think, are damaging and difficult for people to navigate, especially when perpetrated by the person who should be the most concerned about our well-being. But she is experiencing both of those things happening at the same time. And so in my mind, it's easy to see why she acted the way that she did. On top of that, we're told Joseph is attractive, and he was probably really nice to her, and he probably respected her, and he was probably more attentive to her than her own husband was. She had enough of it, so she tries to use her power to get what she wants. The posture of Potiphar's wife's heart is, what am I missing, and how do I get it? Joseph then becomes just a means to an end, right? And he's actually the answer to both of her problems. If he agrees to her proposition, she gets some of the intimacy that she's been wanting. If not, she gets to do what she ends up doing in the story, which is stick it to her husband for taking away her rightful position and giving it to a foreign slave, while getting rid of Joseph, and so that she can have her job back. The posture of her heart is pretty obvious from the way that she tells the story of what happened. She blames Potiphar, and she appeals to the inherent power she should hold over Joseph's inherited power. She says, that Hebrew slave that you brought came to me to make sport of me. It's pretty clear from what happens that after this, Potiphar didn't believe his wife. It says he burned with anger, but it doesn't say towards Joseph. If he really truly believed his wife, Joseph would have been killed on the spot, or at least castrated. Instead, he's thrown in prison. But also, this is not just any prison. This is the nice prison. This is the place, this is called the King's Prison. It's the equivalent of like where Wall Street executives go today, like where Martha Stewart spent a bunch of time. It's basically a resort. It's still a prison, but at least he has his life and all of his parts are intact. And actually, Potiphar throwing him in prison protected him from his wife. As an equal citizen, she could have had him killed or castrated. But now he's in jail and he's out of the picture and she seems to be satisfied, which just further reveals that this is what she was after, just getting her power back. So her stance was, what am I missing and how do I get it? Contrast that with Joseph's posture throughout this story. He's sold into slavery. He works hard and does what he can to bless his master. He refuses to betray his master and his master's wife, quite frankly. He gets thrown into prison. And the text tonight, the story concludes by telling us how things go for Joseph in prison. And we see that he does the same things once he's there. It says, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those who were held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Joseph is so awesome that he's put in charge of the prison that he's a prisoner in, which seems like, a little bit of a conflict of interest. But what else would you expect from the prison where all of the Wall Street executives go? So Joseph basically is like, sell me into slavery, that's fine. The people that buy me are going to be better for it. Throw me in prison, that's fine. The prison, everyone there, including the warden, are going to be better because I'm there. Joseph is continually treated unfairly. He's continually beat down, yet this is his outlook. No matter where I find myself, the lives of the people there around me are going to be better for it. How's that possible? I think this all happens because the posture of Joseph's heart is, what do I have and how can I share it? And I don't think it's a stretch to assume that this was instilled into Joseph throughout his life growing up. His great-grandfather was a guy named Abraham, who was the first guy that God promised that he and his descendants would be the means through which God would bless the entire world. We talked about this last week. Joseph's great-grandfather was the first person to hear the mind-blowing world-changing idea that he and his people were blessed by God to be a blessing to the rest of the world. Joseph would have grown up hearing that over and over and over again. We are blessed to be a blessing to the rest of the world. Our purpose is to bless everyone that we come in contact with. So we have these two diametrically opposed postures of the heart. What am I missing and how do I get it? What do I have to share, or what do I have and how can I share it? What am I missing and how can I get it is really shaky ground to live your life on. It's shifting sand that constantly changes anytime you happen to get what you thought you were missing. And as soon as you do, you realize something else is missing, and you start chasing after that. It's an endless and exhausting way to live, and it reduces the people around you, not people for you to care for and bless, but as a means for your ends. But the opposite posture, what do I have and how can I share it, is solid ground. To me, this is an incredibly compelling, life-giving way to live. The context of your life can change dramatically, but the posture of your heart doesn't. It doesn't matter if you're the favorite child of a wealthy farmer or a slave or a prisoner or in charge of the empire, which is a position that Joseph is eventually given. Pharaoh essentially puts him in charge of the entire Egyptian empire, but that's a story for another day. The point isn't what position do you find yourself in. The point is, no matter where you find yourself, you can always be focused on what you have and how you can use that to bless others. And it allows the people in your life to remain people and not just means to the ends of your own desire. Why does this matter for us? Because as I said at the beginning tonight, the posture of our hearts determines how we use our power. And if it's uncomfortable for you to think about having power, because we think of power so kind of one-dimensionally as like government or kings or things like that. Just substitute power for influence. Our culture is obsessed with this idea of power or influence. Who hasn't, who doesn't? How is power being used to keep some powerless while making others even more powerful? Which tends to be good and noble questions to ask and pursue. Unbalanced and unchecked power is prone to incredible depths of corruption and destruction. But I think a more important question for us to be focused on as followers of Jesus are, what is the posture of my heart? And how do I use the power or influence that I have? Our culture, I can't say our culture tonight. I just did. Our culture is drowning in false messages that you're lacking something. And if you could just get that thing, if you could just finally get that thing that you've been missing, you'll be fulfilled. The means justifying the ends is becoming a more and more accepted outlook. And fulfillment of personal desires is seen as the highest good. What am I missing and how can I get it? But the call to Abraham, which defined the life of Joseph, is the same call to those of us who follow Jesus today. And it stands in stark contrast to these things. We are blessed by God to bless the world around us. What do I have and how can I share it? Regardless of whether those people deserve it or not. Like we talked about last week, using the gifts and resources we have, how can we join God to incite love and reduce suffering and increase joy for the people in our life? For family, for friends, for neighbors, for coworkers, for your community. The posture of our hearts determines how we use our power. So how do you use what you have? I guess a better question first is, what is the posture of your heart? And how do you use your power and influence in your life? And if you don't like the answers that you come to with those questions, what are you going to do to change those things? Will you pray with me? God, thank you that God, thank you for stories like this that help reframe and push back against the very human narrative that we have been struggling with since it seems like the dawn of time. That the point of our lives is to chase after the things that we feel like are missing. To endlessly go on this rat race of trying to get our hearts to a place where we feel fulfilled. Thank you for these stories that stand in stark contrast to that, to remind us that fulfillment is found so much more in taking what we do have and using it to bless others, using it to show the world what you are like. God, I pray that that is continually the people that we are growing to be, people who use the blessings we have to join you, to incite love and reduce suffering and increase joy in the world. God, I pray that the people in our lives would be better for us being there. God, I pray that this little pocket of Colorado would be better because we are a community in it. Keep leading us forward in how we do that, both in our lives individually and together as this expression of your church. We love you, God. Amen.